My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am the president of Burkina Faso, but before any title, before any uniform, I am a man who must answer to his conscience and to God. I was born in a land that has known dignity and pain at the same time. Burkina Faso is not rich in money, but it is rich in people who wake up every morning and choose to live honestly. Even when life is hard, I carry their voices with me into every room I enter. I also carry my own fears, my own doubts, and my faith. In early February of the year 2026, our capital city, Ouagadougou, received a high-level delegation from the International Monetary Fund. These meetings are never casual. For decades, they have followed a familiar pattern across Africa. Numbers are placed on the table, conditions are spoken politely, pressure is applied quietly. The language is technical, but the consequences are always human. This delegation was led by Kenji Okumura, the deputy managing director of the institution. He came with experience, with charts, and with expectations shaped by history. He also came to a country that has chosen a different path, even when that path is narrow and uncertain. In the days leading up to the meeting, many people expected me to prepare in a predictable way. They assumed I would rehearse arguments, calculate trade-offs, and measure how much pain could be tolerated in exchange for short-term relief. That is how these moments are usually approached. But that morning, I did something else. I did not begin with strategy. I did not begin with numbers. I did not begin with fear. I stopped. Before I reached the door of the meeting room, I paused in silence. Not because I was unprepared, but because I wanted to be empty of noise. In that stillness, I prayed to Jesus Christ. Not for victory, not for clever words. I prayed for clarity, for honesty, and for the strength to refuse what should not be accepted. At that moment, something shifted inside me. The weight of expectation lifted. I no longer felt like a representative of a fragile economy standing before powerful institutions. I felt like a man who knew exactly where he stood and why. That pause changed everything that followed. I remember the corridor clearly, even now. It was quiet in a way that only government buildings can be quiet, where footsteps sound heavier than they should, and the air seems to hold old conversations inside its walls. The meeting room was just ahead of me. The door was closed. Behind it waited officials, advisors, translators, documents, and expectations that had been rehearsed long before I arrived. I stopped a few steps before that door. This was not hesitation. It was not fear. It was recognition. For many years, leaders like me have been taught that strength is shown by how quickly you enter such rooms, how confidently you speak, how skillfully you negotiate. We are trained to believe that momentum is everything, that pausing is weakness, that silence invites pressure. But in that moment, I understood something different. If I entered that room carrying the noise of the world inside me, I would leave it carrying obligations that did not belong to my people. So I stopped. I did not reach for my phone. I did not turn to my advisors. I did not review talking points one last time. I closed my eyes, not dramatically, not visibly, but inwardly. I spoke to Jesus Christ the way a man speaks when he knows no one else can help him decide what is right. I did not use long words. I did not ask for signs. I said in my heart that I did not want to betray the poor quietly, or sell the future politely, or exchange dignity for approval. I asked to be protected from clever compromises that sound reasonable, but leave wounds that last for generations. That prayer did not feel emotional. It felt grounding. When I finished, I noticed something that surprised me. My shoulders had relaxed. My breathing was slower. The sense of urgency that usually surrounds meetings like this had dissolved. I was still aware of the seriousness of what lay ahead, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt clear. In that pause, I realized that the door in front of me was not the most important threshold of the day. The real threshold was inside me. If I crossed that line with fear, I would negotiate like someone asking for permission. If I crossed it with clarity, I would speak like someone entrusted with responsibility. I stood there for only a short moment, but it felt complete. When I opened my eyes, I was not carrying the anxiety of a nation under financial pressure. I was carrying the calm of a man who knows that conscience is not negotiable. Only then did I reach for the door. As I walked into the meeting room, nothing on the surface looked different. The table was long and polished. The flags were arranged carefully. The documents were stacked neatly, as if order itself could guarantee a good outcome. Faces turned toward me with polite attention. Some smiled, some observed quietly. All of them were ready. What had changed was not the room. It was me. The clarity that came after that prayer did not arrive like a revelation from the sky. It arrived quietly, like a settled decision that no longer needs to argue with itself. I knew with certainty what could not be placed on the table, no matter how attractive the numbers looked. Our budgetary sovereignty was not for sale. Our strategic resources were not bargaining chips. The daily survival of our people was not a variable to be adjusted. For years, we have been told that discipline means cutting first where people feel it most. Reduce subsidies, reduce social spending, reduce protections. The language is calm, technical, and reassuring. It speaks of balance and confidence and long-term stability. But behind those words, I have seen the reality. I have seen families pushed closer to hunger. I have seen children leave school not because they lack ability, but because their parents lack options. That morning, the figures that might once have felt overwhelming no longer had power over me. Large sums of money were mentioned, presented as support, as partnership, as opportunity. In the past, such numbers have silenced rooms. They have made leaders second-guess their instincts. They have made resistance feel irresponsible. But clarity changes how you see numbers. I understood, without needing to debate it internally, that short-term relief often carries long-term obedience hidden inside it. I saw clearly the cost that does not appear on spreadsheets: dependency, loss of agency, and the quiet erosion of decision-making power. As the discussions began, I listened carefully. I did not interrupt. I did not challenge immediately. I allowed every proposal to be fully explained. And as I listened, I measured each sentence not against political convenience, but against conscience. That is when I noticed something else. Because I was not searching for approval, I could hear more accurately. I could separate concern from habit, advice from assumption. Some of what was said came from genuine belief in a model that has been repeated many times. But repetition does not make a model just. The clarity I carried did not make me aggressive. It made me precise. I knew exactly where the lines were, and because of that, I did not need to defend them loudly. The meeting began in a way that felt familiar, yet subtly different. The opening remarks were polite, measured, and careful. There was respect in the tone, but also caution, as if everyone sensed that this would not be an ordinary exchange. I took my seat, folded my hands lightly on the table, and listened. Usually these conversations move quickly into prescriptions. Reduce this, restructure that, adjust timelines, tighten spending. The sequence is well rehearsed, almost automatic. But this time something slowed the rhythm. The proposals came, but not with the usual certainty. Words were chosen more carefully. Pauses appeared where there are normally none. I noticed it immediately. The familiar conditions were presented, but they were softened. Not erased, not withdrawn, but introduced as possibilities rather than inevitabilities. Subsidy reductions were mentioned with qualifiers. Social spending was discussed with an unusual emphasis on timing and context. It was as if the room itself was waiting to see how far it could go. No one said it aloud, but I felt it clearly. The balance of posture had shifted. In the past, leaders from countries like mine are often expected to react defensively. We are expected to justify ourselves, to explain why our people cannot absorb more pressure, to argue for mercy within a framework already decided. That expectation shapes the room before a word is spoken. But I did not react that way. I did not rush to counter. I did not plead. I did not signal anxiety. I simply listened, nodded when appropriate, and asked for clarification where needed. My calm was not strategic. It was natural. I was not holding my ground aggressively. I was standing on it quietly. That unsettled the rhythm. I could see it in small ways. A sentence would begin confidently, then slow. A recommendation would be framed, then reframed. Advisors glanced at one another more often than usual. This was not confusion. It was adjustment. They were used to resistance driven by desperation. They were not used to refusal that came from certainty. As the discussion continued, I realized that my silence was doing more work than arguments ever could. Because I was not trying to win, there was nothing to push against. The usual pressure points did not activate, the meeting did not escalate, it recalibrated. For the first time that day, I saw something I had rarely seen in such rooms. Genuine attention. Not agreement, not concession, but attention. And that, I understood, was the first real surprise. There came a point in the meeting when the proposals were no longer abstract. They moved from general principles into concrete suggestions. This is always the moment when the atmosphere changes, when words begin to carry weight, when every sentence quietly asks a leader to choose between appearing cooperative and remaining faithful to the people who sent him there. The recommendations were presented calmly, almost gently. They spoke of reducing public spending to stabilize fiscal balance. They spoke of restructuring key sectors to attract investment. They spoke of efficiency, confidence, and market signals. On paper, the arguments were coherent. The logic was clean. The language was professional. I had seen these proposals before, not only in documents, but in lives. As I listened, images came to my mind without effort. A farmer standing in line for subsidized fuel that allows him to bring food to market. A mother calculating which meal can be skipped so school fees can be paid. A clinic deciding which services must be reduced because funding has been tightened quietly, responsibly, according to a plan that looks sound from far away. These are not emotional exaggerations. They are predictable outcomes. For many years, leaders have been asked to accept these outcomes as unfortunate but necessary. We are told that pain now will bring stability later, that sacrifice today will attract opportunity tomorrow, that discipline requires distance from immediate suffering. But conscience does not work that way. When my turn came to speak, I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize the consequences. I spoke slowly and clearly. I said that certain measures, regardless of how reasonable they appear in reports, would place an unacceptable burden on families who already live close to the edge. I said that food security is not an adjustable parameter. I said that sovereignty over essential services is not a temporary inconvenience to be corrected later. Then I said something very simple. I said no. Not abruptly, not defiantly, just firmly. I expected, perhaps out of habit, some form of pressure to follow, a reminder of consequences, a warning about markets, a suggestion to reconsider. That is often how these moments unfold. But it did not happen. The room did not harden, voices did not sharpen, no one leaned forward aggressively. Instead, there was a pause, a real pause, not an awkward one. Notes were adjusted. A sentence was rewritten in the air before being spoken. I realized then that something important had shifted. When conscience is not presented as a position to be negotiated, it loses its usefulness as leverage. It becomes a boundary rather than a demand. And boundaries, when held calmly, tend to be respected. They were accustomed to tension. In rooms like that, tension is expected. It is almost a tool. Voices rise slightly. Arguments repeat themselves in new language. Time is used as pressure. Fatigue becomes leverage. Leaders are worn down not by confrontation but by endurance. I did not give them that. Because I was not fighting, there was nothing to resist. Because I was not anxious, there was nothing to exploit. My calm was not a technique. It was the natural result of having already decided, inwardly, what mattered and what did not. I could see that this unsettled them more than anger ever would have. They had prepared for pushback. They had prepared for bargaining. They had prepared for appeals to hardship and history. What they had not prepared for was a leader who had already made peace with saying no, and who did not need to justify that peace with theatrics. The conversation changed tone almost without anyone announcing it. Questions became more open-ended. Instead of explaining why certain measures were necessary, they began asking how Burkina Faso envisioned its own path forward. Instead of emphasizing timelines and benchmarks, they asked about priorities and constraints. This was the second surprise. It was not dramatic. There was no visible reversal of position. But something subtle happened that I recognized immediately. The room stopped assuming weakness. It stopped treating resistance as temporary. It began to accept that it was facing a government that was not waiting to be rescued and therefore could not be controlled by rescue. That realization shifts behavior. When a leader enters a room already convinced of his own fragility, every suggestion sounds like a lifeline. When a leader enters grounded in responsibility rather than fear, suggestions must compete with principle. I did not lecture them. I did not speak about faith or prayer or morality. I spoke about practical realities. I spoke about what our people could absorb and what they could not. I spoke about gradual reform rather than abrupt disruption. I spoke about stability that includes social cohesion, not just numerical balance. And because I was not trying to impress anyone, my words carried a different weight. I noticed that advisors on the other side began taking notes more carefully. Not because I was dominating the discussion, but because the discussion had shifted. It was no longer about how to implement a model. It was about whether the model fit the context. Calm has a way of slowing rooms down. It removes urgency that is artificial and exposes what is essential. In that slower pace, assumptions become visible. And once visible, they can be questioned. That was the second surprise. Not that minds were changed, but that listening replaced insistence. At a certain point, I noticed the clock. Not because I was eager for the meeting to end, but because time was no longer being used against anyone. The agenda that had been designed to stretch across many hours was moving faster than anticipated. Not rushed, not dismissed, but resolved. This was unusual. Normally, such meetings extend because pressure needs time. Proposals are repeated in different language. Concerns are revisited from new angles. Fatigue becomes part of the process. Agreement, when it comes, often arrives at the end of endurance rather than at the end of understanding. That day, endurance was not required. Once it became clear that certain conditions would not be accepted, there was no attempt to circle back to them later. No one said, perhaps we can revisit this. No one suggested postponement as a strategy to soften resistance. The conversation simply moved on. I understood then that the leverage they expected to use no longer existed. When a country enters negotiations believing it has no alternative, every discussion is about survival. When a country enters knowing it can walk away, discussions become about alignment. That distinction changes everything. We began to speak about Burkina Faso's own direction. Not as a defense, but as a statement. I spoke about our intention to build self-reliance gradually, even if it meant slower access to external financing. I spoke about being careful with debt, not because debt is immoral, but because dependency is dangerous when it becomes structural. I spoke about partnerships that respect pace and context, rather than impose speed and uniformity. These were not radical statements. They were measured. But they were rooted in a different assumption: that dignity is not a luxury to be pursued after growth, but a foundation without which growth becomes hollow. The room adjusted again. There was no announcement of a breakthrough, no dramatic concession, but there was a recognition that the usual framework did not fully apply. The meeting ended earlier than planned, not because we had compromised, but because there was nothing left to force. As we stood and exchanged formalities, I could sense something unspoken. Burkina Faso had not rejected dialogue, it had rejected coercion. And in doing so, it had altered how its path was perceived. When the delegation left, I remained seated for a moment, not to celebrate but to reflect. The outcome would not make headlines. There was no sensational agreement to announce, but something more important had happened. We had demonstrated that saying no does not require confrontation, it requires clarity. I did not speak about faith during that meeting. I did not quote scripture. I did not explain my prayer or reference Jesus Christ aloud. And yet, faith was present in every word I chose and every decision I made. Faith, when it is real, does not need to announce itself. What I carried into that room was not religious language, but consistency. I did not shift my tone depending on the reaction I received. I did not soften principles to gain approval. I did not harden them to project strength. I remained the same from beginning to end. That consistency is rare in spaces shaped by power. Often, leaders adjust themselves unconsciously. We speak one way when pressure rises, another when it falls. We calculate constantly. That calculation can be felt by others, even when it is not visible. It creates instability, and instability invites manipulation. Faith removes that instability. Because I was not relying on my own cleverness to navigate the meeting, I did not need to adapt myself to the room. I let the room adapt to the truth I carried. That truth was simple. My responsibility was not to secure approval, but to protect people. I could sense that this steadiness had an effect beyond the table. My advisors noticed it, the translators noticed it. Even the visiting delegation seemed to adjust their posture slightly, as if the tone of the room had been set by something deeper than negotiation. This is how faith becomes collective strength. Not by persuading others to believe what you believe, but by acting in a way that removes fear from the space. When fear leaves, clarity follows. When clarity appears, even those who disagree can engage honestly. I've learned that faith does not make decisions easier, it makes them cleaner. It strips away false options that exist only because we are afraid to disappoint, afraid to be isolated, afraid to stand alone. That day, I did not feel alone. I felt connected not only to God, but to generations before me who had faced different pressures with the same question in their hearts. Will I choose comfort, or will I choose what is right? Faith answered that question before I entered the room. Everything else followed naturally. I have seen what happens when leaders place power first. Power demands constant feeding. It asks for reassurance, loyalty, numbers, appearances. When power comes first, every decision is filtered through one question: how will this affect my position? That question quietly replaces every other one, even when the leader believes he is acting for the public good. When God comes first, the questions change. The first question becomes simpler and harder at the same time. Is this right? Not profitable. Not popular, not defensible in the language of institutions, simply right. A leader who is not anchored in conscience will eventually be ruled by figures on paper. Numbers begin to feel more real than faces. Forecasts become louder than hunger. Promises of future stability begin to outweigh present suffering. This is not because leaders are cruel, but because they are afraid. Fear is the most expensive advisor in any room. When I say that a leader must place God above power, I do not mean public displays of faith or moral speeches. I mean private alignment. I mean deciding, long before a crisis arrives, what lines will never be crossed, even if crossing them would bring applause, funding, or relief. That alignment creates freedom. In that meeting, I did not feel free because I had authority. I felt free because I had limits. I knew what I would not trade. I knew what did not belong to me to give away. I knew that no office, no loan, no partnership was worth the quiet betrayal of people who trust me with their future. When God is placed above power, fear loses its grip. The fear of markets, the fear of isolation, the fear of being misunderstood by the world. These fears do not disappear, but they no longer govern decisions. I have learned that courage is not loud. It does not need to announce itself. It shows up as steadiness when others expect compromise, as patience when others expect haste, as refusal when others expect compliance. This is not heroism, it is discipline. A leader who places God first does not become inflexible. He becomes clear, and clarity, more than force, commands respect. There is a belief, especially in international affairs, that power is final. That financial institutions decide what is possible. That markets punish disobedience. That systems once established cannot be resisted without severe consequences. I understand why people believe this. These institutions command resources that can move governments, currencies, and entire regions. Their language is precise. Their reach is global. Their influence is real. But it is not absolute. I have learned that systems are powerful only when fear cooperates with them. They depend on quiet consent, on the belief that there is no alternative, on the assumption that resistance is irresponsible. Once that belief is questioned, their authority begins to shrink to its true size. God's authority works differently. It does not threaten. It does not rush. It does not need enforcement. It operates through truth, and truth has a strange quality. It does not need to win arguments to prevail. It only needs to be lived consistently. In that meeting, nothing supernatural happened in a visible way. No voices changed suddenly. No positions collapsed dramatically. And yet, something fundamental was exposed. The limits of institutional power became clear the moment it encountered a conscience that would not bend. Financial strength can propose conditions. It cannot command surrender without cooperation. Legal frameworks can apply pressure. They cannot manufacture legitimacy where there is none. Influence can intimidate. It cannot replace truth when truth is calmly spoken and calmly held. I do not say this to diminish institutions or dismiss expertise. Order matters, structure matters, cooperation matters, but none of these things are supreme. When they attempt to override justice, they reveal their own weakness. God's authority does not cancel human systems. It places them in perspective. When a leader walks in faith, he does not challenge power directly. He simply refuses to treat it as ultimate. That refusal is quiet, but it is deeply unsettling to systems built on compliance. That day, I did not defeat anyone. There was no victory to celebrate. But there was a boundary that could not be crossed, and everyone in the room understood it. No force is stronger than truth when truth is carried without fear. And no institution, however powerful, can overcome a conscience anchored in God. When the room was empty and the doors were closed, there was no sense of triumph. There was only quiet. That quiet mattered to me, because it told me I had not betrayed myself in order to appear successful. No agreement had been signed that day that would excite headlines or satisfy those who measure leadership by immediate gains. But something far more important had been affirmed. I had learned, not in theory but in practice, that Burkina Faso could say no without trembling. That refusal, when rooted in clarity rather than defiance, does not isolate a nation, it defines it. For years, many countries like mine have been told that sovereignty must be earned later, after compliance, after growth, after patience. I saw clearly that sovereignty begins the moment fear is removed from decision-making. The meeting did not produce spectacle, it produced alignment. I understood that leadership is not proven in moments of applause, but in moments where compromise would be easy and costly at the same time. That day, the cost of compromise was clear, and because it was clear, refusal did not feel heavy. It felt responsible. I also learned something personal. Faith is not a shield that protects leaders from difficulty. It is a compass that prevents them from getting lost while navigating it. When faith leads, sovereignty does not need to be declared loudly. It expresses itself naturally through posture, tone, and boundaries that do not move. I thought of the people who would never hear about that meeting. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, parents. They would not know what conditions had been proposed or declined. They would only know over time whether life became harder unnecessarily or whether dignity had been preserved quietly. That is how leadership should work. The most important lesson I carried away was this: when faith guides the path, fear has no place to stand, and when fear is absent, even the most powerful institutions recognize limits they cannot cross. That understanding stays with me. It informs every room I enter, every decision I face, and every silence I choose to honor. As I bring this reflection to a close, I speak not as a negotiator and not as a symbol, but as a man who knows how fragile life is and how quickly power passes. I have learned that history does not remember the cleverness of agreements as much as it remembers whether leaders protected the weak when no one was watching. I wish peace for the world, not the kind of peace that hides injustice under polite language, but the peace that comes when truth is allowed to breathe. I wish strength for Africa, not strength measured by borrowed approval, but strength rooted in self-respect, patience, and responsibility. I wish clarity for leaders everywhere, especially those who feel trapped between pressure and conscience, between survival and surrender. To my brothers and sisters of the Muslim faith, I say this with sincerity. Righteousness is not weakened by dialogue, and dignity is not lost by standing firm. Justice belongs to God, and those who seek it honestly will never stand alone, even when the path is narrow. To my brothers and sisters of the Christian faith, especially those who walk with Jesus Christ in their hearts, I say this: faith is not proven by loud declarations, but by quiet obedience. Christ did not teach us to fear the powerful, but to serve the truth. When leaders kneel in private, they can stand without trembling in public. To the leaders of the Sahel and beyond, I speak as one who shares your burdens. We are often told that our choices are limited, that patience means compliance, that survival requires silence. I have learned that this is not true. Our people do not ask us to be perfect, they ask us to be faithful. Faithful to their lives, their land, and their future. To those watching from far away, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and across the world, many of you have lived long enough to see how quickly certainty collapses. You have seen leaders rise and fall, systems praised and then questioned, promises made and forgotten. You know, perhaps better than most, that moral clarity matters more than clever management. I do not ask you to agree with every decision I make. I ask only that you remember this. When leaders place God above fear, above money, above reputation, something quiet but powerful happens. Decisions become cleaner, harm becomes harder to justify, and dignity, once preserved, becomes contagious. The world does not need more noise. It needs more leaders willing to pause before doors, to listen before speaking, and to refuse before betraying what cannot be replaced. I believe this is possible, not because institutions will change overnight, but because consciences still exist, and God still speaks to those who are willing to be still. I carry no illusion that this path will be easy, but I carry no doubt that it is right. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and I speak these words in truth, without fear and without disguise. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words come from conscience, not convenience. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have shared here is true, because it was lived, not performed. If these reflections have resonated with you, if they have stirred memory, faith, or quiet agreement, I invite you to remain part of this conversation. Share your thoughts where others can read them. Stay connected, not for spectacle, but for understanding. The world changes slowly, but it changes first in the hearts of those who are willing to listen. May wisdom guide us, may courage steady us, and may God keep us aligned with what is right, long after the doors close and the rooms fall silent.